You know how it feels when you're trying to get a handle on something complex,
Mm-hmm.
but you're just bombarded with information from all sides, like you're trying to learn from a fire hose?
Uh-huh.
We get it. That's why we created the deep dive,
Mm.
to give you a clear, focused understanding of fascinating topics without the, well, information overload.
Yeah. What's really striking today is that even though we have so much information at our fingertips, truly understanding it can still feel, kind of out of reach. Our goal with these deep dives is to take well-researched material and pull out the key insights, those aha moments that can really shift how you see things.
And today, we're diving into something truly fundamental, the relationship between our brains and how we learn. We're going to be exploring a really thought-provoking 1998 article by Burns and Fox called The Educational Relevance of Research in Cognitive Neuroscience. Now, you might be wondering, why should I care about the brain when I'm thinking about education?
Right.
And that's exactly the question we're going to answer for you.
Exactly. This isn't about abstract science. It's about understanding the very organ that makes learning possible. We'll be looking at how cognitive neuroscientists investigate the brain, what their findings reveal, and most importantly, what all of this means for how we approach education in areas like attention, memory, reading, and even math. We want to extract the most valuable insights for you.
All right, so let's get straight to it. Why is it so important that we consider the brain when we talk about education? For a long time, it seemed like psychology and neuroscience were doing their own thing almost in separate worlds.
That's a great point. The article highlights that historically there was a tendency in psychology to study cognition and behavior somewhat independently from the underlying brain processes. It was almost a divide and conquer strategy, with researchers focusing on different aspects of the mind in isolation.
So the learning folks were over here, and the brain folks were over there, and they weren't really talking to each other.
Pretty much. Increasingly, though, the article emphasizes a really important shift. Researchers began to recognize that these separate areas are deeply interconnected. How we think and feel isn't happening in some abstract space. It's fundamentally tied to the activity of our brains.
Uh-huh.
And this growing understanding in cognitive psychology naturally started to influence educational psychology, with more and more people seeing the crucial role of the brain in learning.
Okay, so those walls started to come down. Now, the article lays out a couple of really strong arguments for why we absolutely can't ignore the brain if we're serious about understanding and improving education.
Mm.
What are those core reasons?
Well, the first major reason centers on the need for really accurate and detailed models of how learning and motivation actually work.
Hmm.
If we want to help students learn effectively, we need to understand the underlying mechanisms.
Makes sense.
The article gives a powerful example. Imagine a theory of learning that talks about concepts and skills, but completely overlooks the learner's belief in their own ability, their self-efficacy. If that key element is missing from your model, any teaching methods you design based on that model are likely to be less successful because you're not addressing a fundamental driver of learning.
Right, it's like trying to understand why a car isn't running smoothly without even looking at the engine.
Hmm.
You might check the tires, but you're probably missing the real issue.
Precisely. And this is where neuroscience can make a huge contribution. By looking at the brain, we can get a much more precise and nuanced understanding of these cognitive processes. It can even help us decide between different psychological theories. For instance, there's been a long debate about working memory. Is it one single system, or are there multiple parts working together?
Yeah, I remember that debate.
Neuroscience research can provide evidence that supports one view over the other, leading to more accurate and useful models of how we hold and manipulate information.
That makes perfect sense. Better understanding of the engine leads to better ways to fix it. So that's the first big reason. What's the other key argument against ignoring the brain?
The second set of reasons directly addresses some of the classic arguments that were used to justify studying the mind without considering the brain. The article points out some real weaknesses in these older viewpoints. Take the analogy of the mind as software and the brain as hardware.
Right.
The idea was that psychologists, like software designers, didn't need to worry about the specific hardware the software was running on.
Yeah, I remember that idea. The brain is just the machine that runs the learning programs we design.
The article argues that while that analogy might be a helpful starting point for thinking about complexity, it's actually quite misleading when we're talking about the human brain. In a computer, the software and hardware are distinct and separate. You can often run the same software on different machines. But with the brain, our thoughts and feelings, our cognition, aren't separate from the brain's activity. They are fundamentally intertwined with it. There isn't a mental program that can just be transplanted into different brains without any impact.
The article uses a great analogy here, comparing it to studying flight.
Mm.
You wouldn't try to understand how a bird flies without considering its biological structure, right?
Mm,
Just like you can't really understand how we learn without considering the biological reality of our brains.
exactly. Then, the article touches on the idea that psychology and neuroscience often use different terms to describe similar things. For example, a psychologist might talk about remembering a math fact, while a neuroscientist might talk about activation in a specific brain network.
Hmm.
The author suggests that these could very well be different ways of describing the exact same underlying process. The apparent incompatibility might just be a problem of translation. We haven't fully figured out how all our psychological terms map onto their corresponding brain activity and vice versa.
So it's not necessarily that we're talking about completely different things, just that we're using different languages to describe them. Like
Right.
two mechanics describing the same engine problem using different jargon.
Precisely. And finally, the article tackles the argument of reductionism, the concern that explaining psychological phenomena in terms of brain activity somehow diminishes the importance or complexity of our mental lives.
Yeah, I've heard that concern.
The authors argue that this concern only really holds if you believe in a strict separation between mind and brain. If we accept that our thoughts and feelings are a result of brain activity and that psychological and neurological descriptions are just different levels of analysis of the same thing, then the fear of reductionism becomes less of an issue, their suggestion. Instead of trying to eliminate one set of terms in favor of the other, we should aim to become bilingual, fluent in both the language of psychology and the language of neuroscience.
That's a really insightful way to look at it. So even if you're not entirely convinced that the mind is purely a product of the physical brain, there's still a powerful argument to be made for at least understanding how the brain contributes to learning.
That's the key. The authors acknowledge that those who hold a belief in a non-physical mind might not be completely persuaded, but their central point is a call for integration for everyone involved in educational psychology to thoughtfully combine what we know about the brain with our understanding of cognition.
Okay, so we agree the brain matters. But how exactly do scientists in cognitive neuroscience go about investigating what different parts of the brain do? The article outlines 5 main methods they use. Let's start with one that sounds pretty straightforward. Reaction time.
Reaction time, yeah. As the name implies, it's simply how quickly someone responds to a stimulus. The article points out that there are consistent differences in reaction times between individuals and across different ages for both simple and more complex responses. Interestingly, faster reaction times tend to show a modest correlation with IQ scores, and even with the speed at which nerve signals travel in our bodies.
So does that mean faster brain processing equals higher intelligence? That sounds almost too neat and tidy.
And the article does point out some important limitations. While measuring reaction time is easy, inexpensive, and doesn't involve anything invasive, the meaning of these correlations isn't always clear-cut.
Okay.
For example, many reaction time tasks also involve problem-solving strategies. So, are we really measuring the speed of basic neural processing, or are we seeing the effects of someone? The core insight here is that while reaction time can give us a basic measure of processing speed, intelligence and learning are far more complex than just how quickly we can respond to something.
Right. It's like knowing that a car's top speed is high, but that doesn't tell you anything about its fuel efficiency or how comfortable the seats are.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the next method? Gross electrical recording, like EEG. I've seen those brainwave charts. They look pretty intimidating.
They can look complex, but the basic idea is that EEG, or electroencephalography, records the overall electrical activity of the brain using electrodes placed on the scalp. Think of it like listening to the general electrical chatter of the brain from the outside.
Okay.
This technique has been really valuable for identifying brain regions that are particularly active when we're processing different kinds of sensory information, like when we're listening to speech or feeling a touch. And within this overall electrical activity, there are specific patterns called event-related potentials, or ERPs. Yeah, these are like little blips in the EEG that occur in response to specific events or stimuli. The article mentions a couple: the P300 wave, which often appears when we encounter something unexpected, and the N400 wave, which tends to show up when we process something semantically out of place, like hearing coffee with sugar and socks.
Oh.
This suggests our brains are constantly anticipating and reacting to the meaning of information, which is key to how we understand things.
That's fascinating. So these electrical signals can give us a real-time look at how our brain is processing information.
Mhm.
What are the big advantages and disadvantages of using EEG in ERPs?
Well, the major pluses are that it's non-invasive, meaning it doesn't involve surgery or radiation, and it can be used with a wide range of people, including infants and young children. It also has excellent temporal resolution. It can track brain activity changes very quickly, millisecond by millisecond, which gives us a better sense of the timing of brain events than some other methods. However, the big downside is that the EEG signal we record from the scalp is a combination of electrical activity from many different areas of the brain. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where a specific signal is originating and what the underlying neurons are doing.
Ah, okay, so it's kind of a blurry picture, spatially speaking.
Exactly. While you can get more precise recordings by placing electrodes directly on the brain, that's obviously not a routine procedure for research in humans. So there's always some uncertainty about the specific brain locations involved when we use EEG. Also, things like differences in skull thickness between individuals can affect the signals, and the temporal resolution advantage over techniques like fMRI is becoming less significant as fMRI technology improves.
Okay, moving on to a method that sounds a bit more involved, lesions. We're talking about studying what happens when parts of the brain are damaged.
Exactly. Researchers who study the effects of brain damage on cognitive functions are often called cognitive neuropsychologists. By carefully observing individuals who have experienced brain injury, they try to connect specific brain regions to specific cognitive abilities. The article gives the classic examples of Broca's area, where damage often impairs the ability to produce speech,
Right, I know that.
and Wernicke's area, where damage can lead to fluent but nonsensical speech and difficulties understanding language. Observing these selective losses, especially when you see what are called double dissociations, where damage to one area affects ability A but not B, and damage to a different area affects B but not A, provides strong evidence that those abilities rely on distinct brain regions.
Okay, so that suggests separate circuits.
Yeah, think of it like having separate circuits in the brain for different skills. Studying the effects of temporary brain inactivation before surgery or the severing of connections between the two halves of the brain has also yielded valuable insights.
So it's like trying to figure out what a part in a machine does by seeing what breaks when you take it out.
Mhm.
But it can't be that simple, right? What are the limitations of studying lesions?
You're right. There are several important things to keep in mind. First, naturally occurring brain injuries often affect multiple small areas, making it difficult to isolate the precise effect of damage to just one specific region.
Okay, that makes sense. It's rarely a clean removal.
Exactly. Second, just because damage to a certain area leads to a problem with a particular ability doesn't necessarily mean that area controls that ability. The article uses a clever analogy. If you remove a resistor from a radio and it starts making a loud noise, the resistor wasn't a noise suppressor, it was just part of a larger circuit.
Ah, interesting analogy.
Third, brain damage usually impairs a skill to some degree, rather than completely eliminating it. If there is a strict one-to-one mapping between a brain region and a specific skill, you might expect the skill to vanish entirely after significant damage.
But that rarely happens.
Rarely, completely. And finally, there's a lot of individual variability in the location and extent of brain damage and its effects. Damage to the frontal lobe might affect language in one person, while temporal lobe damage does the same in another. So, while lesion studies have been incredibly important for our initial understanding of brain function, the findings need to be interpreted cautiously.
That makes the puzzle even more complex. Okay, let's talk about the more high-tech methods. Brain imaging techniques like MRI and PET scans. We hear about these a lot in the news.
These techniques have really transformed how we study the living brain. Computed tomography, or CT scans, and basic magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, primarily give us detailed pictures of the brain's structure.
Okay, the physical layout.
Right. They help us locate injuries, tumors, and understand the size and shape of different brain regions. Before these tools, researchers had to rely on surgery or examining the brain after death, but these initial imaging techniques couldn't show us which parts of the brain were active when someone was thinking or performing a task.
Right, that's the key difference.
That's where functional MRI, or fMRI, and positron emission tomography, or PE scans, come into play. They can show us areas of increased brain activity.
How do they actually do that? It sounds very futuristic.
Well, all types of MRI, including fMRI, use the natural magnetic properties of atoms in our bodies, especially in water. When you put someone in a strong magnetic field, these atoms line up.
Okay.
Then, a brief pulse of radio waves is sent in, which temporarily knocks some of the atoms out of alignment. As they return to their original alignment, they release a tiny bit of energy that can be detected and used to create an image.
Wow.
fMRI specifically focuses on the different magnetic properties of oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin in the blood. The idea is that when a part of the brain becomes more active, it needs more oxygen, which leads to an increase in blood flow to that area and a change in the ratio of oxygenated to deoxygenated hemoglobin. fMRI can detect these changes, giving us an indirect measure of brain activity.
So more blood flow to a specific area is a sign of more activity there. What about PET scans? How do they work?
PET scans involve introducing a very small amount of a radioactive substance into the bloodstream. The principle is similar. More active brain regions will use more nutrients and oxygen, leading to increased blood flow and a higher concentration of the radioactive tracer in those areas.
Mhm.
The PE scanner then detects where this tracer is most concentrated, creating an image that shows areas of higher activity. For example, if you ask someone to think about words while they're in a P scanner and you see a hot spot of activity in a particular area of the frontal lobe, you might infer that area is involved in processing the meaning of words.
Both sound incredibly powerful, but I'm guessing there are limitations with these as well.
Absolutely. fMRI has become very widely used because it offers good spatial detail, decent temporal resolution, doesn't involve radiation, and you can do repeated scans on the same person. However, the equipment is very expensive.
Ah, right. Cost is a factor.
Yeah. Researchers often use a technique called subtraction, where they compare brain activity during a task to activity during a baseline state to isolate the activity related to the task. The statistical analysis involved in this can be complex and requires careful interpretation.
Okay.
Also, what the fMRI signal actually reflects isn't always straightforward. The change in signal that we measure is actually due to a decrease in deoxygenated hemoglobin, and this decrease can be triggered by various physiological events, not just increased neural firing. So we can't always say with absolute certainty that an fMRI signal changed directly and solely means increased neural activity.
Interesting nuance. And PET scans. What are the challenges there?
PET scans are also quite expensive and require specialized facilities to handle the radioactive materials, which limits their availability and often means studies have smaller numbers of participants.
Okay, smaller sample sizes.
Right. The temporal resolution can also be a bit of an issue, as the activity is often averaged over longer time periods than the cognitive processes themselves take. While newer radioactive tracers with shorter half-lives are improving this, both fMRI and PE findings in educational research need to be interpreted with a critical eye.
Okay, that leads us to the final method. Animal studies. Obviously, researchers can do things with animal brains that would be impossible or unethical to do with human brains.
That's right. Animal studies allow for much more direct manipulation and monitoring of brain regions. Researchers can surgically create lesions, transplant brain tissue, introduce specific substances, manipulate brain temperature, and even record the activity of individual neurons.
Wow, single neurons.
Yeah. Studies where animals are raised in different environments and their brains are later examined also provide valuable information about how experience shapes the brain. The big advantage is the level of control and precision you can achieve when studying specific brain circuits and their functions.
But how much can we really take from studying a rat's brain or a monkey's brain and apply it to something as complex as human learning?
That's the critical question, isn't it? Animal behavior is often less complex and flexible than human behavior. Animals don't have higher-level abilities like reading or abstract reasoning in the same way humans do. And importantly, the specific brain regions responsible for certain cognitive functions can differ between species.
Oh, okay. Location matters.
Definitely. For example, the brain areas involved in working memory aren't exactly the same in rats and humans. The way the brain develops and matures also varies considerably across species. So, while animal studies have given us fundamental insights into basic brain mechanisms like neuroplasticity and the effects of experience, we have to be very cautious when trying to apply those findings directly to complex human cognitive skills relevant to education.
Oh.
The article emphasizes that we can't simply assume that what holds true for an animal brain will automatically be true for a human brain, especially when it comes to higher-level learning.
So it sounds like each of these methods gives us a valuable piece of the puzzle, but none of them alone provides the complete picture of how the brain supports learning.
Exactly. The most reliable conclusions about how the brain and cognition are linked come when we see consistent findings across multiple different neuropsychological methods, for instance, if results from human lesion studies are supported by brain imaging studies in humans and align with findings from animal research.
Okay, converging evidence.
Exactly, converging evidence.
Mm.
And when these neuroscientific findings also make sense in light of what we've learned from traditional psychological experiments, the authors highlight the excitement surrounding newer techniques like fMRI, but caution against accepting findings without carefully considering their inherent limitations.
Right, don't jump to conclusions.
Precisely. They also point out a really interesting trend of researchers combining different neuroscientific approaches in the same study. For example, using both PET and MRI can give us better information about both the location and the structure of brain activity, while combining PET and EEG can help us track both where and when brain activity is happening.
Ah, getting the best of both worlds.
Kind of, yeah. They even give an example of a PTEAG study that suggests our brains process written words in roughly 3 stages. First, the visual form of the letters, then the sounds associated with those letters, and finally, the meaning of the word.
That's a fascinating look at how these different tools can be used together. Okay, so we've explored how we study the brain. Now, what are some of the really important properties of the brain that these methods have revealed, and how should those properties shape our understanding of how we think and learn?
This is where it gets really interesting for thinking about education. The article argues that just like the physical characteristics of a musical instrument influence the sounds it can produce, the structural properties of our brains constrain the kinds of cognitive processes they can support.
Right. The hardware shapes the software, in a way.
Sort of, yeah, but remembering the limitations of that analogy. So, understanding these fundamental properties is absolutely crucial for building accurate models of how we learn and think. They highlight 8 key aspects that should inform our theories of cognition. The first is localization and specialization.
This is the old question of whether specific mental functions are tied to specific areas of the brain, or if the brain works more as a whole, with different parts contributing generally to all functions.
Exactly. The historical debate between those who believed in strict localization and those who believed in a more global, distributed view has largely evolved. The current understanding acknowledges that while many basic cognitive functions seem to be primarily localized to specific brain regions, more complex abilities like language or problem solving involve multiple brain areas working together in networks.
Okay, so it's networks, not just single spots.
Right. The focus now is on understanding how these functions are carried out, which specific brain regions are involved in each component, and how they communicate with each other. The article also takes a moment to debunk the popular left brain, right brain teaching myth.
Oh, yeah, that one.
While there are definitely some areas where one hemisphere tends to be more dominant, for example, the left hemisphere is often more involved in language for most people, and the right and spatial processing these are relative tendencies, not absolute divisions. Most tasks we perform rely on the coordinated activity of both hemispheres.
Right.
So the idea of tailoring teaching to someone's dominant brain side isn't really supported by the neuroscience.
So no teaching to your left brain learners versus your right brain learners then. What's the next key property of the brain?
The second property is parallelity. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that many of the basic operations that make up a more complex cognitive process often happen simultaneously, in parallel.
Okay, things happening at the same time.
Exactly. This means that cognitive theories that propose strictly step-by-step linear processing might not accurately reflect how the brain actually works. Connectionist models of cognition explicitly embrace this idea of parallel processing, while other theories often assume a more serial flow of information or don't make clear assumptions about it. It's also important to note that parallel processing doesn't necessarily mean that different brain systems are completely independent. They can start out being very interactive and become more specialized or modular as we develop and learn.
Okay, so the brain is handling many different aspects of a task at the same time. What about the connections between all those brain cells?
That's the third crucial property: patterns of connectivity. We're talking about an absolutely enormous number of neurons in the brain and even more connections or synapses between them. And these connections aren't just random. Many are partly pre-wired through our genes, and even as new connections form, they tend to do so with specific target cells.
Not just a jumble of wires.
No, not at all. Some connections are excitatory, making other neurons more likely to fire, while others are inhibitory, making them less likely to fire. There are also connections that send information forward in processing and connections that send information back. This incredibly high level of interconnectedness helps to explain why a small brain injury doesn't always lead to a complete loss of function, and it supports theories that emphasize the importance of highly interactive cognitive subsystems. Theories that propose largely independent modules might not fully capture this essential property of the brain.
That makes sense. It's like a vast interconnected network. If one link is damaged, there are usually many other pathways for information to travel. What's the fourth key property?
Probabilistic activity. Both basic and more complex cognitive functions are thought to be carried out by groups of neurons or assemblies rather than by single neurons acting in isolation.
Groups of neurons, okay.
Yeah. For a particular function to occur, what matters is the overall pattern of activity across a group of neurons. An individual neuron within that assembly might be active at one moment and not the next, even when the same function is being performed. Some cognitive models, like connectionist models, and those that explicitly incorporate probabilities, reflect this inherent variability in neural activity, while others don't.
So it's not like flipping a single switch for a specific thought. It's more like a chorus of neurons, where the overall sound, the pattern of activity, is what matters.
Exactly, that's a great way to put it. The fifth property is redundancy. The brain often seems to perform more elementary operations than are strictly necessary for a given task.
Like doing extra work.
Kind of. For example, our visual system processes a wide range of features of an object, even if we only need to see its color to identify it. This redundancy might be a built-in safety mechanism, providing backup in case of damage, or when we're dealing with unclear or incomplete information.
Oh, okay. A failsafe.
Possibly. It also helps to explain why individuals with specific learning disabilities can often still function effectively in many areas, and why even high-performing individuals might have relative weaknesses in certain underlying cognitive components. This suggests that the simplest, most streamlined psychological models might not always be the most accurate representation of how the brain actually operates.
So the brain is almost like it has extra capacity or backup systems in place. What's the sixth property?
Individual differences in morphology. While we all have the same basic brain regions in roughly the same locations and with similar general shapes, there are normal variations in the exact size, shape, and location of these regions from one person to another.
So my brain isn't exactly like yours.
Nope. These differences are thought to arise from the somewhat random nature of how neurons migrate and form connections during prenatal development, as well as other developmental factors. Even identical twins who share almost identical genes have slightly different brain structures.
Even identical twins?
Yeah. The article suggests that we're more likely to find average differences between groups, for instance. A certain brain structure might be slightly larger on average in one group compared to another, rather than absolute differences where everyone in one group has a certain feature and no one in the other does. However, the direct relationship between specific brain morphology and specific cognitive abilities is still an area of ongoing research and isn't yet fully understood.
So our brains are like fingerprints. They share a common pattern, but each one is unique in its details. What about how the brain changes as we grow? That must be a really important factor in learning.
Absolutely. That's the seventh key property. Developmental processes. The brain of an infant is dramatically different from the brain of an adult in terms of the number of neurons and connections, the degree of myelination, and overall organization.
Right. Big changes happen early on.
Huge changes. There are critical processes that shape the developing brain, including the strengthening of synapses that are used and the weakening or elimination of those that aren't use it or lose it, basically. And the insulation of nerve fibers with myelin, which speeds up signal transmission. Abnormal development can result from problems during the initial creation and migration of neurons, insufficient pruning of unnecessary connections, or extreme deprivation of stimulation. The article proposes that developmental trends in brain features like the number of synapses and overall metabolic activity might underlie the age-related changes we see in cognitive abilities, such as the emergence of Piaget's stages of cognitive development, the development of phonemic awareness, and changes in memory capacity. There's an ongoing debate in the field about the relative contributions of our genes, nativism, and our experiences, empiricism or constructivism, in driving these developmental changes in the brain.
The classic nature versus nurture argument playing out at the level of brain development makes perfect sense. And finally, the eighth property has a rather technical name: epigenetic synaptogenesis. What does that entail?
This refers to the idea that our experiences are encoded and stored as specific patterns of synaptic connections in the cortex, the outer layer of the brain. Early in development, there's an overproduction of both neurons and synapses, which provides the brain with a tremendous capacity to learn and adapt to a wide range of potentially unexpected experiences.
So it's ready for anything, almost.
In a sense, yeah. So rather than being born with specific knowledge or recognition abilities hardwired in, our brains are initially prepared to attend to fundamental features of the environment. Then, as we have experiences, certain synaptic connections are strengthened and stabilized while others are weakened and eliminated, creating unique patterns of connections that represent our individual learning histories.
Learning physically changes the brain's wiring.
Exactly. This initial overproduction and subsequent pruning of synapses also provides a degree of plasticity early in life, which can be beneficial for recovering from early brain damage. While the brain retains the ability to change and adapt throughout life, a property known as neuroplasticity, the long-term effects of different types of experiences on the detailed patterns of brain connectivity are still being actively investigated through longitudinal studies.
Those are some incredibly fundamental properties of the brain, and it really makes you think about how they should inform our approach to education. So what are the big picture implications of all of this for how we think about teaching and learning?
Well, the article argues that our theories of learning and motivation really need to take these underlying brain properties into account. Higher-level cognitive functions are built upon a foundation of numerous lower-level functions that operate probabilistically, in parallel, and often with a degree of redundancy, and these are localized in specific brain regions.
Okay.
Educational psychology theories should reflect this inherent complexity. We should expect to see only modest correlations between performance on any single lower-level cognitive skill and overall academic achievement. And similarly, we should anticipate relatively small effects from interventions that target only one specific cognitive function.
So no silver bullets targeting just one skill.
Probably not. Approaches that are multifaceted and address multiple interacting components of learning are likely to be more effective. Studying children with learning disabilities can be particularly valuable for revealing the underlying lower-level functions that contribute to more complex skills.
Right. Seeing what breaks down helps understand the whole system.
Exactly. And the rapid brain development that occurs in infancy and the preschool years strongly suggests that these early periods are critical for laying the foundation for later academic success, highlighting the importance of early childhood education. Ultimately, we should be evaluating our cognitive theories not just on their logical consistency, but also on their brain realizability, how well they align with what we know about the brain's structure and function.
Brain realizability. I like that term.
Yeah. The article specifically points to Adams's 1990 model of reading as a really good example of a theory that is highly consistent with the neuroscience of reading due to its emphasis on the parallel and interactive processing of different aspects of language.
That really shifts the way you think about designing effective learning experiences. Now let's dive into some specific areas where research in cognitive neuropsychology has direct relevance to education. The article focuses on both general processes like attention and memory and specific academic skills like reading and math. Let's start with those foundational domain general processes, beginning with attention.
Attention, yeah. As the article emphasizes, it's absolutely fundamental to learning. We're constantly bombarded with information, and our ability to selectively focus on what's important is crucial for what we end up learning and remembering.
Definitely.
Difficulties with attention, as seen in conditions like ADHD, can have a significant impact on a student's ability to succeed in school. And contrary to the earlier idea of attention as a single, unified ability, neuroscience research suggests that it's actually a complex set of at least 7 distinct component operations.
7 different components of attention. That's more nuanced than I realized.
Yeah.
What are some of those key aspects?
Well, these components include things like being able to become alert to new information, the ability to interrupt ongoing mental processes when something important happens, being able to identify the source of a change in our environment, the ability to shift our focus from one thing to another, the ability to concentrate on a new target, and the ability to ignore distractions and prevent our attention from being drawn back to something we've already looked at.
Okay, a whole suite of skills.
Exactly. Research using animal models, studies of adults with specific brain injuries, and brain imaging techniques like PET and EEG has shown that these different components of attention are supported by a network of interconnected brain regions, including areas like the reticular activating system, the prefrontal cortex, the parietal lobes, and the midbrain. Damage to different parts of this attentional network can lead to very specific kinds of attentional deficits.
Interesting.
This highlights that when we talk about attention in an educational context, we're really talking about a collection of different skills that rely on different parts of the brain working together.
So it's not just that some people have more attention and others have less. They might have specific strengths or weaknesses in these different components of attention that has significant implications for how we support students who struggle to focus. What about memory? That's another cornerstone of learning.
Right. Just like attention, cognitive neuroscience has shown us that memory isn't a single entity. It's also multifaceted and involves different brain systems working together. This is apparent in several ways. For example, even simple pieces of information, like words, are often encoded in multiple forms: visual, sound-based, how we articulate them, and their meaning.
Multiple codes.
Yes, multiple codes. And each of these codes is associated with activity in different brain regions. Brain imaging studies like PET scans have provided clear evidence of this. Furthermore, research has identified at least 5 different memory systems.
5.
Yeah, at least 5. Procedural memory, which is for skills and habits. Perceptual priming, which is an unconscious form of memory that affects how we perceive things. Short-term or working memory, which is for holding and manipulating information temporarily. Semantic memory, which is our general knowledge of facts and concepts. And episodic memory, which is our memory for personal experiences and events.
5 different memory systems. That seems complex, but it also makes intuitive sense when you think about remembering how to ride a bike versus remembering the capital of a country versus remembering what you ate for dinner last night.
Exactly. And neuroscientific evidence, including studies using PE scans and research on individuals with specific types of brain damage, strongly supports these distinctions, showing that different brain regions are critical for each type of memory.
Okay.
For instance, the hippocampus, a region deep in the brain, plays a crucial role in forming new permanent memories, while areas in the frontal and parietal lobes are more involved in working memory and the conscious recollection of past events. We even see what we talked about earlier, double dissociations, where damage to one brain area affects one type of memory but leaves others intact, and damage to a different area has the opposite effect.
Right, reinforcing the idea of separate systems.
Exactly, providing even stronger evidence for these distinct memory systems. While this multi-system view of memory might seem less straightforward than a single, unified memory system, it appears to be a more accurate reflection of how our brains actually work, and aligns well with the way educational psychology considers the different ways we encode and retrieve information. The article also briefly mentions the important role of inhibition, a key domain general process largely supported by the prefrontal cortex, which is essential for filtering out irrelevant information and staying focused during learning.
Okay, those are the fundamental domain general processes. Now let's move on to the domain-specific skills, starting with reading. We know that learning to read can be a real hurdle for many students. What insights does cognitive neuroscience offer us in this area?
Well, since animals can't read, research on the neural basis of reading in humans has relied heavily on EEG studies, PET scans, and detailed analysis of reading impairments in adults who have experienced brain injury.
Right, the lesion studies again.
Exactly. These studies have revealed a variety of distinct types of reading difficulties, broadly classified as visual word form dyslexias, which affect the initial visual processing of written words, and central dyslexias, which involve problems in later stages of processing.
Could you give us some examples of these different types of dyslexia?
Certainly. Visual word form dyslexias can include things like spelling dyslexia, where individuals read words letter by letter, neglect dyslexia, where they might consistently misread the beginnings or ends of words depending on the location of brain damage, and attentional dyslexia, where they have difficulty reading a letter when it's surrounded by other letters.
Okay.
Central dyslexias include surface dyslexia, where individuals struggle to read irregular words because they rely too much on sounding out words letter by letter.
Ah, like trying to sound out yacht.
Exactly. And deep dyslexia, which is characterized by an inability to sound out unfamiliar words and sometimes difficulties with abstract words, often linked to damage in various brain regions involved in language processing. Interestingly, studies of children with developmental dyslexia using standardized reading assessments and PE scans of typical adult readers tend to support and expand upon these findings from acquired dyslexia.
How so?
A common characteristic of developmental dyslexia is difficulty with reading made-up words, like blark, and performing tasks that require manipulating the sounds and words, suggesting a relative weakness in the phonological processing system compared to their ability to process the visual forms of words.
That really lines up with a lot of what we know about the importance of phonics instruction in early reading.
Absolutely. The research also underscores that reading is not a single, simple skill, but rather involves a network of multiple interconnected tasks, including perceiving letters, mapping those letters onto sounds, understanding the grammar of sentences, extracting the meaning of words, and integrating this information with our existing knowledge.
It's a complex web.
Very much so. These different aspects of reading seem to be supported by brain regions that are somewhat specialized but also highly interconnected. Cognitive neuroscience research on reading supports the idea of breaking down the reading process into these key components: orthographic processing, visual, phonological processing, sound, semantic processing, meaning, and syntactic processing, grammar.
Wow.
The article specifically highlights Adams's 1990 model of reading, again, as a particularly good example of a theory that aligns well with brain research. It's a connectionist model that proposes that these different processors operate in parallel and interact with each other, which fits nicely with the patterns of reading difficulties that have been observed.
So a comprehensive understanding of how we learn to read needs to consider all these interacting components, much like the brain itself does. What about math skills? That's another area where many students face challenges. What does cognitive neuroscience tell us about how we learn and perform math?
Well, our understanding of the neural basis of math skills has largely come from studying individuals with acquired math disorders following brain injury and from research on developmental math disabilities in children. Brain imaging techniques haven't been used as extensively in this area compared to reading, for example.
Okay, so more lesion and developmental studies here.
Right. Studies of adults with acquired math difficulties have identified several specific types of impairments, including problems understanding the meaning of spoken or written numbers, difficulty with basic arithmetic facts and procedures, and impairments in the spatial representation of numbers, which is important for tasks like multi-digit calculations.
Hmm.
Interestingly, many of these acquired math disorders are associated with damage to regions in the left hemisphere of the brain, similar to some reading disorders, which might help explain why some children with math learning disabilities also experience difficulties with reading.
Potential overlap.
Yeah. However, a specific type of math difficulty involving spatial processing, called spatial acalculia, is often linked to damage in the right hemisphere.
And what about developmental math learning disabilities in children? What have researchers found there?
Research has identified a couple of main types of developmental math difficulties. Procedural deficits, where children struggle with the steps involved in solving math problems.
Like carrying numbers in addition.
Exactly, things like that. And fact retrieval deficits, where they have trouble memorizing and recalling basic arithmetic facts like 7 times 8. These types of difficulties seem to have different developmental trajectories. Procedural difficulties often tend to improve over time as children develop more efficient strategies, while fact retrieval deficits can be more persistent.
Interesting distinction.
And these patterns in developmental math disabilities align with some of the types of acquired math disorders we see in adults. The article also points out that higher-level math skills, such as defining math problems and constructing strategies to solve them, are thought to involve areas in the frontal lobes of the brain, which are involved in executive functions, as well as the right hemisphere, which plays a role in spatial abilities.
So multiple areas involved again.
Exactly. This suggests that math, just like reading, is a multifaceted skill that relies on a distributed network of brain regions. Neuroscience research has a lot of potential to further explore and confirm these ideas about the neural basis of mathematical abilities.
It really seems like the overarching theme is that both reading and math, these fundamental academic skills, are not simple single abilities, but rather complex skills that depend on a network of different brain regions and cognitive processes working together in a coordinated way.
Exactly. And gaining a deeper understanding of these underlying neural mechanisms can provide really valuable insights for educators and researchers in terms of how we design more effective instructional strategies and interventions to support learning in these critical areas.
Well, this has truly been a deep dive into the educational relevance of cognitive neuroscience. We've covered so much, from why understanding the brain is essential for education to the specific neural underpinnings of attention, memory, reading, and math. As we wrap up, what are some of the key things you'd want our listeners to take away from this discussion?
I think the central takeaway is that cognitive neuroscience offers a really valuable perspective for understanding the complex cognitive processes that are at the heart of learning and academic skills. It encourages us to see the brain as a fundamental element in how we learn and why certain educational approaches might be more successful than others. It highlights that these processes are multifaceted and involve many different parts of the brain working together.
But the article also emphasizes that we need to be careful about how we interpret and apply these findings, right?
Absolutely. While neuroscience provides us with powerful tools and insights, it's crucial that we interpret these findings with caution and always consider them in the context of traditional psychological research and educational practice. We need to avoid oversimplifications and resist the urge to prematurely apply neuroscientific findings to educational interventions without a solid theoretical understanding of the underlying cognitive processes. Avoid the neuromyths.
Yeah. Right. No brain-based snake oil. So looking ahead, what are some of the really promising areas where future research could help bridge the gap even further between educational psychology and cognitive neuroscience?
The article points to several exciting directions. One is using neuroscience to help us better understand the nature of intelligence, the ongoing debate about whether there's a general intelligence factor, G, or if we have more distinct specific abilities.
The G factor debate.
Exactly. Another really important area is investigating the neurological basis of differences in learning and achievement while being very mindful of the crucial role of environmental factors and the brain's incredible ability to adapt and change plasticity.
Yeah, that's a critical balance.
Definitely. Research could also explore the neurological underpinnings of a child's readiness for school and the impact of early experiences, like preschool, on later academic success. This has potential implications for how we think about things like grade retention, based solely on age, and the ongoing discussions about early childhood stimulation.
Big policy questions there.
For sure. Finally, neuroscience could offer us a more detailed understanding of motivational and metacognitive processes, those crucial aspects of how and why we engage in learning, and how we monitor our own learning.
So much still to discover. It really underscores that understanding how we learn is a continuous and incredibly fascinating journey, right at the intersection of the mind and the brain.
Indeed. And it raises a really interesting question for you, our listener. How might this deeper understanding of the brain influence your own learning strategies and your perspective on education, whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who's curious about how we learn? What specific questions about your own learning or the learning of others might you now be inspired to explore further?
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
The exploration of the mind and brain is a continuous process, and we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable new insights to consider on that journey.